Wife found Soviet spy documents inside her husband's Domino's uniform. On the evening of March 17th, 1983, something was discovered inside a small ranch-style house in suburban Detroit, Michigan, that would unravel a Soviet intelligence operation running beneath the surface of one of America's most iconic companies. The house sat on Oakwood Street in Warren, a working-class neighborhood populated by auto workers, teachers, and small business owners who had migrated from the South and Appalachia in search of factory jobs and the promise of middle-class stability. The street was lined with modest homes built in the 1950s, most of them nearly identical in design, with aluminum siding, single-car garages, and small front lawns that the residents maintained with varying degrees of diligence. But what was happening inside one of these houses, hidden behind the veneer of suburban normalcy, was anything but ordinary. And it was uncovered not by the FBI or the CIA, but by a 31-year-old woman named Carol Anne Whitmore, who found something she was never supposed to see while doing laundry in her basement on a Thursday evening. What she pulled from the pocket of her husband's Domino's pizza delivery uniform would expose an espionage network that had been operating successfully in the industrial heartland of the United States since at least 1979 and possibly longer, compromising information related to automotive manufacturing processes, labor union operations, and defense contractor activities in a region that was home to some of the nation's most sensitive military production facilities. The basement of the house on Oakwood Street in Warren, Michigan smelled like damp concrete and laundry detergent, a combination that Carol Anne Whitmore had grown so accustomed to over the past 7 years that she barely noticed it anymore. It was Thursday evening, March 17th, 1983, and the routine was exactly what it had been every Thursday for as long as she could remember. Dinner finished by 6:30, dishes washed and put away by 7, and then down the narrow wooden stairs to the basement where the washer and dryer sat against the far wall, humming and clanking through their cycles with the kind of mechanical persistence that marked the passage of time in a working-class household. The fluorescent light overhead flickered occasionally, casting uneven shadows across the unfinished walls and the concrete floor that was always cold no matter the season. Carol was 31 years old, thin in a way that suggested not vanity but the kind of economizing that came from stretching a paycheck too far, and she moved through the laundry with the efficiency of someone who had done this task thousands of times before. Robert's Domino's uniform was in her hands, the red and blue polyester shirt with the company logo stitched across the chest, the fabric stiff with dried sweat and the faint smell of pizza sauce and grease. He had come home from his shift a little after midnight, the night before as he always did on Wednesdays, and had left the uniform in the hamper without a word. That was typical. Robert didn't talk much, not about work, not about anything really. 7 years of marriage had taught Carol that silence was his natural state, and she had learned to live with it. She turned the shirt inside out, checking the pockets the way she always did before loading clothes into the machine. Robert was careless about leaving things behind, loose change mostly, sometimes a pen, once a crumpled $5 bill that she had pocketed for herself without mentioning it. But this time her fingers touched something different, something small and stiff, folded tightly and wedged deep into the front pocket of the shirt. She pulled it out slowly, her movements careful, and held it up to the light. It was a piece of film. Not photographic film in a canister, but a small strip of what looked like microfilm, the kind Carol had seen once in a library years ago when she had been helping her father research military records from World War II. The film was no larger than a postage stamp, translucent and dark, folded into a tight square that had been pressed flat as if someone had been carrying it for a long time and wanted to make sure it stayed hidden. Carol's first thought was that it was a mistake, that Robert had picked up someone else's uniform by accident at the Domino's location where he worked, or that one of the other drivers had left something in a shared locker. But the uniform was his. She knew it by the faded stain on the left sleeve, a mark from when he had spilled bleach on it months ago and she had tried unsuccessfully to remove it. She walked to the far corner of the basement where a small workbench sat beneath a window that looked out onto the backyard. A lamp with a bendable neck sat on the bench, the kind Robert used when he was tinkering with small engine repairs, a side job he took occasionally to bring in extra money. Carol turned the lamp on and held the microfilm up to the light, tilting it slowly until the images on the film became visible. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There were diagrams, technical drawings of some kind, precise and detailed, with lines and measurements and annotations that she couldn't fully read but that looked unmistakably like engineering schematics. Beside the diagrams were blocks of typed text, dense paragraphs in a font so small that Carol had to squint to make out even a few words. She saw the words specification and pressure and something that might have been tolerance, but the rest was too small and too faint to decipher without magnification. The film had been professionally produced, that much was clear. This wasn't something a hobbyist had made in a basement darkroom. This was the kind of material that required equipment, expertise, and a reason. Carol lowered the film and stared at it in her hand, her mind racing through explanations that made sense, and finding none that held up under scrutiny. Robert worked at Domino's. He delivered pizzas. He drove a beat-up Chevy Nova through the streets of Warren and the surrounding suburbs, carrying orders to apartment complexes and subdivisions, collecting tips that barely covered the gas he used. There was no reason for him to have microfilm. No reason for him to be carrying technical diagrams in his pocket. No reason for any of this unless something was happening that Carol didn't know about, something that Robert had kept from her. She thought about their marriage, about the 7 years they had spent together in this house. They had met in 1975 at a church social in Hamtramck, a neighborhood on the east side of Detroit where Robert had grown up in a Ukrainian immigrant family. He had been quiet even then, reserved in a way that Carol had found comforting after a string of louder, more volatile boyfriends. They had married in 1976, a small ceremony attended by family and a few friends, and had moved into this house a year later with money borrowed from Carol's parents. Robert had worked at a machine shop back then, a place called Hendricks Precision Tools that did contract work for Ford and a few smaller manufacturers. The pay had been decent, enough to cover the mortgage and the bills, but the shop had closed in 1980 during the recession, and Robert had been laid off along with most of the other workers. He had spent 6 months looking for another machining job before finally taking the position at Domino's, a decision that had felt like a defeat at the time, but that had at least brought in enough money to keep them afloat. Carol set the microfilm down on the workbench and stepped back, her arms folded across her chest. The basement felt colder than it had a few minutes ago, or maybe it was just the weight of what she was holding that made her shiver. She looked at the film again, lying there under the lamp, and felt something shift inside her, a sense that the life she thought she understood was not what it appeared to be. Robert's silence, his late-night shifts, the way he sometimes came home with more cash in his wallet than his paycheck and tips could account for, she had never questioned it before. She had trusted him because that was what you did in a marriage. But now standing alone in the basement with a piece of microfilm that had no business being in her husband's pocket, Carol felt the first cold edge of suspicion settle into her mind. She didn't know what the film was, or where it had come from, or what Robert was doing with it. But she knew with a certainty that made her hands tremble that whatever it was something she was never supposed to find. Carol Anne Whitmore did not confront her husband about the microfilm. She made that decision within minutes of finding it, standing alone in the basement with the strip of film still resting on the workbench under the lamp's harsh light. Confrontation would require explanations, and Carol wasn't ready to hear whatever explanation Robert might offer because she suspected, in a way that bypassed rational thought and went straight to instinct, that any explanation he gave would either be a lie or something worse than a lie. So she folded the microfilm back into its tight square, slipped it into an envelope, and hid it inside a box of old tax returns in the closet of the spare bedroom, a place Robert never went. And then she returned to the basement, finished the laundry, and went upstairs to wait for him to come home from his Friday night shift. He arrived a little after 1 in the morning, the sound of the Chevy Nova's engine cutting out in the driveway followed by the slam of the car door and his footsteps on the front porch. Carol was sitting in the living room with the television on, the volume low, pretending to watch the late-night news. Robert came through the door carrying the smell of pizza and cold air. His Domino's uniform rumpled and his face tired in the way it always was after a shift. He nodded at her, a wordless acknowledgement, and walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. Carol watched him from the corner of her eye, studying his movements, searching for some sign of deception or guilt or anything that would confirm what she had found. But there was nothing. He drank his water, rinsed the glass, set it in the dish rack, and went upstairs to bed. The routine was identical to every other night, and that was what unsettled Carol the most. Over the following week, she began to watch him with a focus that felt both necessary and invasive, as if she were spying on a stranger who happened to live in her house. Robert's shifts at Domino's were supposed to end at midnight, but he rarely came home before 1, sometimes closer to 1:30. When Carol asked him about it once, casually over breakfast on a Saturday morning, he explained that he often had late deliveries or had to help close the store. She had accepted that explanation because it seemed reasonable. But now she wondered if it was true, or if the extra hour was being spent somewhere else, doing something that had nothing to do with pizza. She noticed the money. Robert kept his wallet in his jacket pocket, and Carol had never made a habit of going through it. But one evening while he was in the shower, she opened it and counted the bills inside. There was nearly $200 in cash, far more than he should have had 3 days after payday. His paycheck from Domino's was deposited directly into their joint account, and Carol could see the deposits every 2 weeks, amounts that never varied by more than a few dollars. Tips were supposed to be modest, $5 or $10 on a good night, maybe 20 if he got lucky. But $200 in cash suggested something beyond tips. The phone calls started to stand out as well. Robert received calls at the house occasionally, and Carol had always assumed they were from the Domino's manager or one of the other drivers. But twice in the same week, the phone rang in the late evening, and Robert answered it in the kitchen, his voice low, and then walked out to the garage with the cordless phone in his hand, closing the door behind him. Carol stood at the kitchen window and watched through the glass as he paced back and forth in the dim light of the garage, the phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing occasionally as if he were explaining something or arguing. The calls lasted 10, sometimes 15 minutes, and when Robert came back inside, his expression was unreadable. Carol asked him once who had called, and he told her it was a guy from work asking about a shift trade. She didn't believe him. The locked toolbox had been in the basement for as long as Carol could remember, a heavy metal container that sat on a shelf near the furnace. Robert had told her years ago that it contained tools and spare parts for his side work, engine repairs, and small mechanical jobs he took on for neighbors and friends. Carol had never questioned it because there had been no reason to. But now, in the context of the microfilm and the cash and the phone calls, the locked toolbox felt like another piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see clearly. Carol went to the library. The Warren Public Library was a squat brick building on the corner of Civic Center Drive, and on a Tuesday afternoon when Robert was at work, she walked in and asked the librarian at the reference desk about microfilm. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, explained that microfilm was used primarily for archiving documents, newspapers, historical records, anything that needed to be preserved in a compact format. She mentioned that microfilm was also used by government agencies and corporations for storing sensitive information. And Carol felt her pulse quicken at the words, sensitive information, though she kept her expression neutral. She thought about Robert's past, about the life he had lived before they married. He had been born in Detroit in 1950, the son of Ukrainian immigrants who had fled Soviet-controlled territory after World War II and resettled in the United States under a displaced persons program. Robert's father had worked in a steel mill, his mother in a garment factory, and they had raised Robert and his younger sister in a small apartment in Hamtramck, where Ukrainian was spoken more often than English. Robert had learned both languages fluently, a fact that Carol had always found charming, though he rarely spoke Ukrainian around her. He had attended public schools, graduated from high school in 1968, and gone to work at Hendrix Precision Tools, the machine shop where he had stayed for 12 years until the recession forced it to close. The machine shop had done contract work for Ford, machining parts for engines and transmissions, but it had also worked with smaller manufacturers, some of them involved in defense contracts. Carol remembered Robert mentioning once that some of the work at Hendrix required security clearances. When the shop closed and Robert lost his job, he had struggled to find another position in the same field. After 6 months of unemployment, he had taken the job at Domino's in the spring of 1980, a decision that had felt temporary at the time, but that had stretched into 3 years. Carol wondered now if the job at Domino's was really what it appeared to be, or if it was something else. A cover for activities she couldn't yet name. The late hours, the cash, the phone calls, the microfilm. The pieces didn't fit together into a coherent picture, but they didn't fit into the picture of a pizza delivery driver either. On Friday afternoon, Carol made copies of the microfilm. She went to a photography shop in Sterling Heights, a place she had never been before, and chose specifically because it was far enough from Warren that she wouldn't run into anyone she knew. The clerk behind the counter was a young man in his early 20s with long hair and a bored expression, and when Carol handed him the microfilm and asked if he could make copies, he barely looked at it. She told him it was family genealogy records, old documents from relatives in Europe, and he nodded without interest and said it would take about an hour. Carol waited in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the engine running and the heater on, watching the door of the shop. When the copies were ready, she paid in cash, took the envelope, and drove home. She hid the original microfilm back in the box of tax returns and placed the copies in a separate envelope inside her purse. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with them, but she knew she needed to have them, needed to preserve the evidence in case something happened. That night, Robert came home late again, and Carol sat across from him at the kitchen table while he ate leftover casserole in silence. She watched him, this man she had been married to for 7 years, and realized that she didn't know him at all. The quietness she had once found comforting now felt like a wall, and behind that wall was something Carol was afraid to name. Loyalty pulled at her, the instinct to protect her husband, to believe in him, to find an innocent explanation for everything she had seen. But another feeling, stronger and colder, was beginning to take hold. A sense of duty, not to Robert, but to something larger, something she couldn't yet articulate. And beneath it all was fear, growing with each passing day that whatever Robert was involved in, it was something that could destroy them both. The second piece of microfilm appeared 2 weeks later, and this time there was no ambiguity, no room for Carol to construct alternative explanations. It was a Saturday afternoon, April 2nd, 1983, and Robert had left for his shift at Domino's an hour earlier, taking the Nova and leaving Carol alone in the house. She had spent the past 2 weeks in a state of suspended tension, watching Robert, cataloging his movements, waiting for something to happen that would either confirm her suspicions or allow her to dismiss them. But Robert had given her nothing. His behavior remained unchanged, his routine unbroken, his silence as impenetrable as ever. Carol had been in the bedroom folding laundry when she noticed Robert's jacket lying across the chair in the corner, a heavy denim coat he wore when the weather turned cold. He had left it behind, and Carol, operating on an instinct she didn't fully understand, walked over and picked it up. She checked the pockets, finding nothing at first except a few crumpled receipts and a pack of gum. But when she ran her hand along the lining of the jacket, she felt something stiff and flat sewn into the fabric near the inner chest pocket. Her fingers traced the outline, and she realized the lining had been opened and restitched, creating a hidden compartment. Carol carried the jacket into the bathroom, closed the door, and locked it behind her. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and used a pair of nail scissors to carefully cut the stitches holding the lining in place. The The thread gave way easily, and she reached inside and pulled out another piece of microfilm, slightly larger than the first, but folded in the same tight, deliberate manner. Her hands were shaking as she unfolded it, and she held it up to the light coming through the small bathroom window. This time she could see more. The images on the film were clearer, sharper, as if whoever had produced it had used better equipment or had taken more care in the process. There were blueprints, technical drawings of what looked like automotive parts, gears and pistons and assemblies labeled with measurements and material specifications. Beside the blueprints were pages that appeared to be photocopied from typed documents, and Carol could make out enough of the text to see that they were employee schedules, lists of names organized by shift and department corresponding to local factories. One page showed what looked like notes from a meeting, handwritten in tight script, with references to union negotiations and production quotas. Carol felt her stomach turn. This wasn't random. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate, systematic, the work of someone who had access to sensitive materials and was copying them for a purpose. She thought about Robert's job at Hendricks Precision Tools, the machine shop that had done defense contract work, and wondered if he had taken something with him when the shop closed. She thought about his fluency in Ukrainian and Russian, languages his parents had taught him, and about the Cold War tensions that filled the news every night, stories about Soviet spies and intelligence operations, and the constant shadow of suspicion that hung over anyone with Eastern European roots. Carol's father had been in counterintelligence during World War II, working for the Office of Strategic Services before it became the CIA. He had died in 1979, but Carol remembered conversations they had had years earlier, back when she was in high school and curious about his work. He had told her once that the Soviets ran operations in American industrial centers, targeting factory workers and engineers, people with access to manufacturing processes and technical information that could be useful to Soviet industry or military programs. He had explained that the recruitments were often quiet, based on financial pressure or ideological sympathy or ethnic ties, and that the operations could run for years without being detected. At the time, Carol had found the stories fascinating but distant, the kind of thing that happened in movies or in other cities. But now, sitting on the edge of the bathtub with microfilm in her hands and her husband's jacket lying across her lap, those conversations came back with a force that made it hard to breathe. She knew what she had to do, but the knowledge didn't make it easier. For 3 days, Carol carried the weight of the decision, unable to sleep, unable to eat more than a few bites at each meal, moving through the house like a ghost, while Robert went to work and came home and said nothing. She thought about loyalty, about the vows she had made 7 years ago, about the life they had built together in this small house on Oakwood Street. She thought about what would happen to Robert if she reported what she had found, the arrests and interrogations and trials, the prison sentence that would follow. But she also thought about what would happen if she did nothing, if she let Robert continue whatever he was doing. The fear was what finally decided it. Not fear of the Soviets or fear of betraying some abstract notion of patriotism, but fear of Robert himself, fear of what he had become, fear of what might happen to her if he discovered that she knew, fear that she was living with someone she didn't understand, someone who had hidden an entire part of his life from her. On the afternoon of April 5th, Carol drove to a grocery store in Troy, a suburb far enough from Warren that she wouldn't be recognized. She parked near the back of the lot and walked to the payphone outside the entrance, a metal booth with a folding door that didn't close properly. She fed coins into the slot, dialed the number for the FBI field office in Detroit, and waited while the line rang. A woman answered, her voice professional and detached, and Carol, her throat dry, asked to speak to someone about a national security matter. There was a pause, and then the woman asked Carol to hold. When the next voice came on the line. It was a man's, calm and measured, and he identified himself as Special Agent Thomas Richter. Carol told him in a voice that barely held steady that she had found evidence that her husband was involved in espionage, that she had microfilm showing classified materials, and that she needed to speak to someone as soon as possible. Richter asked her name, asked where she was calling from, and told her to stay on the line. Carol waited, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white, and when Richter came back, he gave her an address and a time. He told her to come alone, to bring the materials she had mentioned, and to tell no one where she was going. Carol hung up the phone and stood in the parking lot, the spring wind cold against her face, and felt the full weight of what she had just done settle over her. There would be no going back from this. Whatever happened next, her life and Robert's life would never be the same. The diner on Van Dyke Avenue in Sterling Heights was the kind of place that served coffee in thick ceramic mugs and kept the lights bright enough to see every crack in the vinyl booth seats. It was a Tuesday afternoon, April 12, 1983, and the lunch rush had passed, leaving only a handful of customers scattered throughout the dining room. Carol Anne Whitmore sat in a booth near the back, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, watching the door and waiting for the man she had spoken to on the phone a week earlier. Special Agent Thomas Richter arrived exactly on time, walking through the door at 2 o'clock and scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years observing people and places for signs of danger or deception. He was in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with graying hair cut short and a face that gave away nothing. He wore a dark suit and a tie that looked like it had been knotted the same way every day for 20 years. And when he spotted Carol sitting alone in the back booth, he walked over without hesitation and slid into the seat across from her. He introduced himself quietly, showing her his credentials, a leather wallet with a badge and an identification card that confirmed he was who he claimed to be. Carol nodded, her throat tight, and reached into her purse to pull out the envelope containing the microfilm copies. She placed it on the table between them, and Richter picked it up, opened it, and examined the contents. His expression didn't change, but Carol noticed the way his fingers paused for just a moment as he held the film up to the light streaming through the window. Carol told him everything. She spoke in a low voice, describing the discovery of the first piece of microfilm in Robert's uniform pocket, the decision to make copies, the surveillance she had conducted over the following weeks. She told Richter about the cash in Robert's wallet, the phone calls he took in the garage, the second piece of microfilm she had found sewn into the lining of his jacket. She described the blueprints and the employee schedules and the union meeting notes, and when she finished, she sat back and waited for Richter to respond. Richter asked questions, specific and methodical, about Robert's work history, his background, his family, his habits. Carol answered as best she could, telling him about Robert's childhood in Hamtramck, his parents' immigration from Soviet Ukraine, his 12 years at Hendrix Precision Tools, the layoff, and the subsequent job at Domino's. Richter took notes in a small leather notebook, and when Carol mentioned that Robert spoke fluent Ukrainian and Russian, Richter underlined something twice and looked up at her with an expression that suggested the information was significant. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Richter told Carol that he would be in touch within 48 hours, that she should continue her normal routine at home, and that under no circumstances should she confront Robert or give any indication that she had spoken to the FBI. Carol agreed, though the thought of going back to the house on Oakwood Street and pretending that nothing had changed felt almost unbearable. Within 48 hours, a task force had been assembled. Richter convened a meeting at the FBI field office in Detroit, a nondescript building on Michigan Avenue that housed the Bureau's counterintelligence division, and he briefed a team of 6 agents on the case. The microfilm had been analyzed by technical specialists, and the assessment was unambiguous. The materials Carol had provided were genuine, and they related to sensitive manufacturing processes used in automotive production and potentially defense-related applications. The blueprints corresponded to components used in engine assemblies being produced under contract for military vehicles, and the employee schedules suggested an effort to map the internal workings of factories that handled classified projects. Background checks on Robert Whitmore began immediately. The initial results showed nothing alarming. No criminal record, no arrests, no history of foreign travel beyond a single trip to Canada in 1977. But as the investigation deepened, details began to emerge that painted a more complex picture. Robert's father, Petro Whitmore, had emigrated from Soviet-controlled Ukraine in 1951 under a displaced persons program, and immigration records indicated that he had been questioned multiple times by U.S. authorities about possible communist sympathies before being granted permanent residency. Robert himself had a cousin in Cleveland, a man named Viktor Kovalenko, who had been investigated by the FBI in 1974 for ties to a Ukrainian social club that the Bureau believed was a front for Soviet intelligence activities. The investigation had not resulted in charges, but Kovalenko's name remained in the files, and the connection to Robert was noted. Richter cross-referenced Robert's language skills with known profiles of individuals recruited by Soviet intelligence, and the pattern fit. Fluency in Ukrainian and Russian, combined with access to sensitive materials through his work at Hendrix Precision Tools, made Robert a textbook candidate for recruitment. Surveillance on Robert Whitmore began on April 15, 1983. Agents established rotating shifts to monitor his movements, with unmarked vehicles positioned near the house on Oakwood Street and additional units stationed near the Domino's Pizza location on 12 Mile Road where Robert worked. A wiretap was installed on the phone line at the Whitmore residence, authorized by a federal judge under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and listening equipment was placed in the garage where Carol had observed Robert taking phone calls. Carol was briefed by Richter in a second meeting, this time at a safe house in Royal Oak, a small apartment the FBI used for sensitive communications. Richter explained that her role was to continue living her life exactly as she had before, to give Robert no reason to suspect that anything had changed. She was instructed to document any unusual behavior, any deviations from his routine, and to report them to Richter through a secure contact method. Carol agreed, though the weight of what she was being asked to do settled over her like a physical burden. She was being asked to spy on her own husband, to live beside him and share meals with him, all while knowing that every word he spoke and every move he made was being recorded and analyzed by federal agents. The surveillance continued for 2 weeks without yielding significant new information. Robert went to work, came home, ate dinner, and went to bed. The phone calls that had once seemed suspicious were revealed to be mundane conversations with coworkers. But Richter and his team remained patient, knowing that espionage operations moved slowly, and that the breakthrough they needed would come only if they waited long enough. The pattern emerged on a Friday night, April 29, 1983, when surveillance agents following Robert Whitmore during his delivery shift observed something that had been occurring regularly but had not yet been identified as significant. Robert left the Domino's Pizza location on 12 Mile Road at approximately 8:30 in the evening, his Chevy Nova loaded with orders for the night, and drove east toward the apartment complexes that made up the eastern edge of Warren. The agents followed at a distance, maintaining visual contact, and they tracked Robert through a series of deliveries that appeared routine. But at 9:15, Robert turned onto East 9 Mile Road and drove to an address that the surveillance team had flagged 3 times in the past 2 weeks. It was a 3-story apartment building, aging brick with exterior staircases and a parking lot that was poorly lit and half empty. Robert parked in front of the building, grabbed a pizza box from the passenger seat, and walked up the stairs to the second floor. Agents watched as Robert knocked on the door of Unit 2C and waited. The door opened and a man appeared in the doorway, his face partially obscured by shadows. Robert handed over the pizza, and instead of turning to leave immediately as he had done at every other stop that night, he stepped inside the apartment and the door closed behind him. The agents noted the time, 9:17. They waited, expecting Robert to emerge within a minute or two. But the minutes passed and the door remained closed. 5 minutes, 10, 15. At 22 minutes, the door finally opened and Robert stepped out. But something had changed. He was no longer carrying the insulated Domino's delivery bag he had taken into the apartment. Instead, he held a smaller bag, plain canvas with no markings, and he walked quickly down the stairs and back to his car. He placed the bag in the trunk, got behind the wheel, and drove away. The surveillance team immediately radioed the information back to the field office, and within hours, FBI analysts had pulled records on the apartment at Unit 2C. The lease was registered to a man named Mikhail Volkov, age 47, who had entered the United States in 1976 on a work visa, sponsored by the American Council for Cultural Exchange, an organization that facilitated educational and cultural programs between the United States and various foreign countries. Volkov's listed occupation was translator, and his employment records showed steady work with the council since his arrival. But when FBI counterintelligence specialists ran Volkov's name through their databases, connections began to surface. Volkov had been flagged in 1978 during a routine review of individuals associated with Soviet diplomatic personnel, though no formal investigation had been opened. His name appeared in surveillance reports from 1979 and 1981, mentioned in passing as someone who had attended social events frequented by suspected KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover. In 1980, Volkov had been photographed at a reception at the Soviet consulate in New York, standing in a group that included 2 men later identified as intelligence operatives. None of this had been enough to justify charges, but it established that Mikhail Volkov was a person of interest. Richter assembled his team and presented the findings. The assessment was clear. Robert Whitmore was making regular deliveries to Mikhail Volkov's apartment, deliveries that took far longer than any legitimate pizza transaction, and he was leaving with items he had not brought in. The most likely explanation was that Robert was passing materials to Volkov during these visits, materials hidden in the pizza delivery bag, and that Volkov was providing Robert with payments or instructions in return. Surveillance continued and the pattern held. Every Tuesday and Friday night, Robert made a delivery to Unit 2C on East 9 Mile Road. The orders came in under different names, alternating between Smith, Johnson, Miller, and Williams, but always to the same apartment. Each visit lasted between 18 and 25 minutes, and each time Robert left, carrying the plain canvas bag. On the night of May 6, 1983, the FBI executed a controlled intercept. Surveillance agents followed Robert as he made his delivery to Volkov's apartment, and when he left 20 minutes later with the canvas bag in hand, they waited until he was driving back toward Warren before initiating a traffic stop. 2 unmarked vehicles boxed Robert's Nova in on a quiet stretch of road, and uniformed officers from the Michigan State Police, working in coordination with the FBI, pulled him over on a pretext of a broken taillight. Robert was ordered out of the vehicle, and while the officers kept him occupied with questions and paperwork, FBI agents searched the car. In the trunk inside the canvas bag, they found bundles of cash totaling $3,200, wrapped in rubber bands and divided into stacks of $100 bills. Tucked beneath the cash was a small piece of paper, folded tightly, with a series of handwritten numbers and letters that appeared to be some kind of code. The agents photographed everything, replaced the items exactly as they had found them, and allowed Robert to continue on his way. He was given a warning about the taillight and sent home, unaware that the contents of his trunk had just provided the FBI with the evidence they needed. Richter reviewed the photographs and the analysis that followed, and the picture became complete. Robert Whitmore was being paid by Mikhail Volkov to pass information. Likely microfilm or photocopied documents related to manufacturing processes and defense production, using his job at Domino's Pizza as cover. Volkov was the handler, the individual responsible for managing Robert, for providing him with instructions and payments, and for ensuring that the materials Robert collected were transmitted back to Soviet intelligence. The operation had been running for an unknown length of time, possibly years, and it had gone undetected because it relied on the most mundane of covers. The scope of the network remained unclear. Richter and his team did not yet know if Robert was the only asset Volkov was running or if there were others. But what was clear was that the operation needed to be shut down, and that the arrests needed to be executed carefully to maximize the intelligence gathered and to ensure that no one involved had the opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. The decision was made to move forward within the next 2 weeks, to prepare arrest warrants for both Robert Whitmore and Mikhail Volkov, and to coordinate simultaneous raids that would bring the network down in a single, coordinated strike. The arrests were executed at dawn on May 20th, 1983, with the precision that came from weeks of planning and coordination between multiple federal agencies. 2 teams moved simultaneously, one converging on the house on Oakwood Street in Warren, the other positioned outside the apartment building on East 9 Mile Road, where Mikhail Volkov lived. The timing was deliberate, designed to prevent either man from warning the other, and the operation unfolded in near silence. The only sounds the muted crackle of radio communications and the footsteps of agents moving into position in the pale light of early morning. Robert Whitmore was taken into custody as he pulled into the driveway at 6:15, returning from a late shift at Domino's. He had barely turned off the engine when FBI agents surrounded the Nova, their weapons drawn, their voices calm but commanding as they ordered him out of the vehicle. Robert complied without resistance, his face pale and confused, his hands raised as agents moved in to cuff him. Carol watched from the front window of the house, her heart pounding as her husband was led to an unmarked car and driven away. At Volkov's apartment, the raid yielded immediate results. Agents breached the door of Unit 2C and found Volkov still in his bathrobe, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee in his hand. He was arrested without incident, and while some agents escorted him out of the building, others began a systematic search of the premises. What they found confirmed every suspicion the investigation had raised. In a closet in the bedroom, hidden beneath a false panel in the floor, agents discovered 2 cameras, developing chemicals, and equipment for processing microfilm. In a filing cabinet in the living room, they found folders containing detailed information on dozens of individuals, auto workers, union officials, and employees at defense contractors, including Chrysler Defense and General Dynamics. In a desk drawer, agents found encryption keys and code books written in Russian. And in a safe bolted to the wall behind a bookshelf, they discovered nearly $40,000 in cash, bundled and stored in envelopes marked with dates and amounts. Robert Whitmore was transported to the FBI field office in Detroit and placed in an interrogation room. For the first 2 hours, he said nothing, invoking his right to remain silent and requesting an attorney. But as the morning turned into afternoon and Special Agent Thomas Richter began laying out the evidence, piece by piece, Robert's resolve began to crack. After consulting with a public defender, Robert agreed to cooperate in exchange for consideration during sentencing. What he told investigators over the next 3 days filled in the gaps that the surveillance had left unanswered. Robert admitted that he had been recruited by Mikhail Volkov in the late summer of 1979, approached at a Ukrainian community picnic in Hamtramck where Volkov had introduced himself as a fellow immigrant. The friendship had developed slowly over months of casual meetings, and Volkov had never pushed, never asked for anything until he was certain that Robert was vulnerable. The vulnerability had been financial. In early 1979, Carol had suffered a miscarriage, and the medical bills had overwhelmed them. Robert had been out of work for months following the closure of Hendricks Precision Tools, and the debts had piled up faster than he could manage. Volkov had offered help, small loans at first, and then eventually a proposition. He had explained that he worked for an organization that needed access to certain types of technical information, and he had offered Robert money in exchange for photographs of documents he had access to through his former job. Robert had hesitated at first, but the desperation had been too strong, and he had agreed. He had photographed blueprints and technical specifications from files he still had from Hendricks, and he had delivered the film to Volkov in exchange for cash. When Robert started working at Domino's in 1980, Volkov had seen an opportunity. The delivery routes took Robert into factory parking lots and industrial areas where he could observe shift changes and gather information about employees who might be approachable for recruitment. The pizza delivery uniform had become the perfect cover, and the regular deliveries to Volkov's apartment had provided a reliable method for passing information and receiving payment. The trial began in September 1983. Carol was called to testify, and the moment she took the stand was one of the most painful experiences of her life. She described finding the microfilm, described her decision to contact the FBI, and when the prosecutor asked her if she had any doubt about what her husband had been doing, she looked directly at Robert, sitting at the defense table with his head down, and said no. Robert Whitmore was convicted on multiple counts of espionage and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Mikhail Volkov, who refused to cooperate with investigators and maintained his innocence throughout the trial, was sentenced to 30 years. Carol filed for divorce while Robert was awaiting sentencing, and the proceedings were finalized in November 1983. She left Michigan 2 months later, moving to Portland, Oregon, where she had a cousin who helped her find work and rebuild a life far from the shadows of what had happened in Warren. The Domino's pizza location on 12 Mile Road closed in early 1984, not because of the case, but because of declining business and a corporate decision to consolidate operations. But the association lingered, and the building sat empty for years, a reminder to those who knew the story of how espionage had hidden itself behind the most ordinary of facades. In the years that followed, Robert Whitmore became a footnote in the larger history of Cold War espionage, one name among many in the files of Soviet intelligence operations, that had run quietly beneath the surface of American life. But for Carol, the case was never just about espionage or national security. It was about the moment she had reached into a pocket and found something that didn't belong, about the choice she had made to look closer instead of looking away. Espionage operations exploit ordinary lives, targeting the vulnerable and the desperate. They rely on the assumption that no one is watching, that routines are invisible, and that a pizza delivery uniform is just a uniform. But sometimes someone notices. Sometimes a wife does laundry and finds something hidden in a pocket. And sometimes that single act of observation is enough to unravel an entire network and to prove that even in the shadows of the Cold War, the most powerful weapon against deception was simply the willingness to see what was really there.